The most dangerous lie in America is the one told with a badge and a calm voice. At Terminal C of Reagan National Airport, beneath white lights so bright they made every face look tired, Officer Travis Hale stopped a black woman walking alone with a leather case file pressed against her side and a boarding pass between two steady fingers. She wore a navy coat, low heels, and the kind of quiet expression people often mistook for weakness. Around her, carry-on wheels rattled over polished tile, coffee steamed from paper cups, and a departure board flickered with flights to Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and back to Washington. Nobody noticed her until Hale stepped into her path like he had been waiting for someone exactly like her. "Ma'am, step aside," he said. His voice clipped, almost casual, the tone of a man used to being obeyed before he explained himself. The woman paused, not startled, just careful. She glanced once at the digital clock mounted above the checkpoint, then back at him. There was no fear on her face, but there was something heavier than fear, something older, as if she already knew how this kind of moment could unfold in public while strangers watched and decided to call it procedure. Hale held out his hand for her ID with a look that suggested he had already judged what he would find. When she gave it to him, his eyes moved over the card, then over her coat, her shoes, her skin, and back again, and a thin smile touched one side of his mouth. "People like you always make this harder than it has to be," he said, not loud at first, just loud enough for the nearby travelers to hear, without feeling responsible. A man near the rope barrier lowered his phone. A woman with a stroller slowed down. The woman in the navy coat bent and gathered one loose page that had slipped from her folder, smoothing the edge with her thumb before she answered. "Then maybe start with the truth," she said softly. That should have ended it. It should have been one more tense airport exchange lost beneath gate changes and rolling luggage. But something in her calm seemed to offend him more than anger would have. Hale straightened, shoulders squaring, as if the crowd itself had become part of the scene. "Step to secondary screening," he said. "Now." She looked past him, up toward the black dome of a security camera fixed above the metal detector, then back at his face. The air between them turned thin. "On what grounds?" she asked. It was a simple question, but in that bright, sterile space it sounded almost forbidden. Hale did not answer right away. He only took one step closer, enough to suggest pressure without ever naming it, and repeated himself with a colder edge. Around them, the airport kept moving, but not really. People were still walking, still sipping coffee, still adjusting backpacks, and yet the whole terminal seemed to lean toward that one small square of tile where a black woman stood alone under fluorescent light, and a white officer decided that his suspicion mattered more than her dignity. Then she lifted her chin, met his stare without blinking, and said the sentence that made the entire terminal go still. "Authority without restraint is just fear wearing a badge." For one suspended second, even the fluorescent hum above the checkpoint seemed to fade. Officer Travis Hale stared at her as if she had crossed some invisible line that mattered more to him than policy ever could. Around them, the terminal kept pretending to be normal. A boarding announcement floated through the air in a woman's polished voice. Ice clicked inside plastic cups from the coffee kiosk. A toddler in a red sweatshirt tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered a question she did not answer. The black woman in the navy coat did not move. She stood with one hand resting lightly on the handle of her leather case file, her boarding pass still tucked between her fingers, her posture composed in a way that made silence feel stronger than noise. Her name, though nobody there knew it yet, was Naomi Carter. She had learned long ago that the world often read calm as permission, softness as surrender, and dignity as something disposable if it arrived in the wrong skin. But Naomi had not built her life by surrendering to other people's fear. She had built it quietly, one impossible year at a time. She was the daughter of a city bus mechanic and a school librarian from Prince George's County, Maryland. She had grown up in narrow hallways lined with secondhand books, where her mother taught her that language could open locked rooms. And her father taught her that character showed itself most clearly when nobody was clapping. Even now, standing in Reagan National with strangers staring and a uniformed man trying to shrink her into compliance, she carried herself with the same stillness that had once taken her through crowded public schools, scholarship interviews, law school exams, and courtrooms where men twice her age had mistaken her patience for uncertainty. The leather case she held was worn at the corners because she actually used it. Inside were hearing notes, legal drafts, and a file marked for a civil rights review scheduled in Washington that afternoon. She had chosen sensible heels because she knew she would be on her feet for hours. She had chosen the navy coat because it was warm without being heavy. She had chosen to travel alone because the work itself was serious enough without spectacle. Nothing about her asked for attention. That, somehow, was what made the attention on her feel even crueler. Hale extended his hand again, but this time it was not really a request. "Secondary screening," he said, his jaw tight. Naomi looked at her identification card still caught between his fingers, then at the silver badge on his chest, then briefly toward the camera above them, fixed and silent in its black casing. There was no panic in her face, only a deep, controlled weariness, the kind that came from recognizing an old pattern in a new room. "I asked on what grounds," she said. Her voice stayed low, almost warm, which made his colder. He shifted his weight and glanced around, aware now of the audience gathering in fragments. A businessman near the stanchions pretended to check his watch while listening to every word. A college student in a Georgetown sweatshirt pulled out one earbud. An airline employee standing at the edge of the line lowered her eyes, then lifted them again. Naomi could feel all of it, the public calculation, the cowardice, the curiosity, the silent relief of people grateful the spotlight had landed on someone else. Still, she did not plead. She did not explain herself beyond what the moment required. She only drew one slow breath and waited, as if she believed that somewhere beyond the noise, truth still had a structure, and sooner or later somebody would be forced to stand inside it. Officer Travis Hale had spent years turning small moments into stages where he could feel large. In places like this, under the hard white light of a federal checkpoint and the watchful rhythm of cameras nobody thought about until it was too late, he understood exactly how power looked when it was worn correctly. Tall enough to command a line with a glance, broad through the shoulders, pressed into a spotless uniform that gave structure to an otherwise ordinary face. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed procedure could be bent if his tone remained official. The silver badge on his chest caught every passing light. The radio at his shoulder crackled with other people's problems. He liked that sound. It reminded him that his voice could interrupt strangers, redirect families, delay flights, and make tired travelers explain themselves when all they wanted was to get home. Most days that was enough. Some days he needed more. Naomi could see it now in the way he held her identification card a second longer than necessary, as though possession alone gave him insight into her life. His eyes moved with practiced contempt, not openly wild, not foolish enough to be obvious to anyone not paying close attention, but sharpened by that polished kind of prejudice that survives by calling itself instinct. He was the kind of man who would never describe himself as cruel. Men like Travis rarely did. They preferred words like order, standards, professionalism, threat assessment. They liked language that rinsed the ugliness clean before anyone could name it. Behind him, the checkpoint stretched in metallic lines and controlled motion. Gray bins slid forward. Shoes tapped against tile. A monitor looped silent instructions about liquids and electronics. Two Transportation Security Administration officers kept working without looking up for too long, though Naomi noticed one of them, a woman with auburn hair pinned into a low twist, glance over twice with a tension in her brow that did not belong to indifference. Travis noticed the same glance and straightened slightly, as if reminded that authority always performed best with witnesses. "Do not make this more difficult than it already is," he said, and now the softness was gone from his voice. He wanted the sentence to sound routine. It did not. It sounded personal. Naomi felt the terminal narrowing around that difference. In his mind, this had already become a story about obedience, and he had cast himself in the role he trusted most, the man who defines the problem and then congratulates himself for managing it. What unsettled him was not her question. It was her refusal to shrink. He had expected annoyance, maybe pleading, maybe the brittle panic of someone afraid to miss a flight. Instead, he had found a woman whose stillness made his own posture look theatrical. That was why he kept speaking, because silence had stopped favoring him. "Secondary screening is not optional," he said. "Last warning. Last warning." The phrase landed in the air with the stale weight of something he had used before, a phrase designed to make resistance sound unreasonable before resistance had even happened. Naomi studied him for one long second and understood what the crowd had not yet named. This was not about airport safety. It was not about her boarding pass, her identification, or the neat leather case held close against her side. This was about a man who had mistaken public space for private control. The terminal was full of polished surfaces, reflective glass, chrome railings, bright advertisements promising comfort for people who could afford first class, and everywhere the quiet machinery of a country that liked to imagine fairness, as long as fairness remained decorative. Travis fit that machinery perfectly. He had learned how to hide hostility inside procedure, how to let suspicion borrow the grammar of law, how to make a woman explain herself simply because he disliked the fact that she did not seem afraid. Then the departure board above gate 22 clicked, and Naomi saw her Washington flight shift one line lower. Boarding had already begun. Travis followed her glance and smiled very slightly, not with joy, but with the private satisfaction of a man who believed delay itself was a form of victory. That was the first moment she knew this would not end at the checkpoint. Naomi let the silence settle before she answered him. Not because she was afraid, and not because she needed time to think, but because she understood something Travis Hale did not. A man who feeds on tension always expects the other person to rush first. He expects a louder voice, a sharper gesture, a mistake he can point to and call justification. Naomi gave him none of that. She adjusted the folder in her arm, straightened one slightly, bent page with the side of her thumb, and lifted her eyes to his with a calm so complete it almost seemed to lower the temperature around them. "If there is a lawful reason to detain me," she said, "state it clearly, and I will comply with a lawful process." Her voice was low, even, and unmistakably American in its cadence, shaped by classrooms, courtrooms, church basements, long nights of study, and every room where she had learned that precision could protect dignity when emotion would be used against it. A few people nearby turned more openly now. The businessman by the rope barrier stopped pretending to read his messages. The mother with the stroller shifted her weight and looked between Naomi and the officer with that uneasy expression people wear when they realize a public scene is no longer awkward, but important. Even the young airline employee at the edge of the line forgot herself long enough to stare. Travis seemed to feel the shift at the same moment. He had expected submission, maybe resentment, but not language that sounded steadier than his own. "You do not tell me how this works," he said. "You have been selected for additional screening." Naomi held his gaze. "Selected by what standard?" she asked. There was no sarcasm in it. That was what made it cut. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The answer should have come quickly if it were real. Instead, he gave her the same hard look men like him often reached for when facts failed them and performance had to carry the rest. "Ma'am, step aside," he said again, each word clipped flatter than before. Naomi did not step back, but neither did she challenge him with her body. She only remained where she was, grounded in the narrow rectangle of polished airport tile, like someone who knew that composure itself could become testimony. Above them, the camera dome watched from its black housing, silent and absolute. The bright floor reflected shoes, suitcase wheels, and the cold lines of the checkpoint stanchions. Somewhere overhead, a boarding announcement called for final passengers on a flight to Charlotte. Another followed for a delayed flight to St. Louis. The terminal kept speaking in its normal language of movement and inconvenience, yet a second reality had opened inside it, smaller and sharper, centered on the question Naomi had asked and Travis could not answer. He took her boarding pass from the top of her folder and glanced at it with a quick flick of irritation. "You are going to Washington," he said, as if the city itself were evidence. "Yes," Naomi replied, "and I intend to get there on time." Something in that sentence bothered him more than it should have. Perhaps it was the absence of apology. Perhaps it was the fact that she spoke like a woman accustomed to being obeyed by no one and respected by the right people anyway. He shifted closer to the lane opening and lifted one arm in a gesture meant to direct her toward the side area. "This is your last chance to cooperate," he said. Naomi looked briefly past him toward the glowing departure board, where her flight status had changed from boarding to final call. The letters pulsed amber against the blue screen, small and impersonal, the kind of update most people would treat as routine. But in that moment it felt like the first cost of someone else's prejudice, measured not in bruises or broken things, but in minutes stolen from a life that had already earned better. When she looked back at him, her expression had changed just slightly. Not weaker, sharper, more resolved. "I am cooperating," she said. "What you are asking for is obedience without cause." The auburn-haired Transportation Security Administration officer nearby finally stopped sorting bins and looked directly at them. A college student took one step closer, then stopped himself. The toddler in the red sweatshirt hid behind his mother's coat. And Travis, feeling the attention gather into something he could no longer fully control, made the mistake powerful men always make when dignity refuses to kneel. He decided to turn a question into a confrontation. The moment Travis moved, the terminal changed shape around him. It was still glass and steel and polished tile, still gate numbers and rolling suitcases, and the burnt smell of airport coffee drifting under bright lights. But now every face nearby had sharpened with that same uneasy question people ask when they sense a line is being crossed, and no one with authority seems willing to name it. Naomi did not raise her hands. She did not step forward. She did not give him the scene he wanted. She only kept her folder close against her coat and said, with a steadiness that made several people glance up at once, "I have asked you a lawful question." Travis answered by reaching for control in the only language he trusted. His hand closed over her boarding pass. He angled his body to block the lane completely, turning a public checkpoint into a personal wall. "You are now delaying a security process," he said, louder than before, loud enough for strangers to hear only the official words and miss the private hostility beneath them. "If you continue to resist direction, there will be consequences." The mother with the stroller drew her child closer. The college student in the Georgetown sweatshirt looked from Naomi to the camera above them, then back again, as if trying to decide whether witnesses still mattered in a place built to record everything. Naomi could feel her Washington flight slipping away 1 minute at a time, yet the urgency inside her did not become panic. It became clarity. This was no longer a misunderstanding that better manners could smooth over. It was an abuse of posture, of setting, of assumption. Travis had discovered that her calm did not make her smaller, and now he wanted to make that calm look like defiance. "I am not resisting," Naomi said. "I am asking you to explain yourself." The sentence landed in the air with almost unbearable precision. It was too clean for him to hide inside. Too true. Travis lifted his radio and spoke into it with clipped efficiency, requesting support in the tone of a man creating his own evidence in real time. Naomi watched the performance unfold with a kind of sorrow she did not show on her face. She had seen versions of this before, not only in airports, but in court transcripts, sworn statements, internal reviews, civil complaints filed years too late, each one carrying the same dry grammar of power protecting itself after the fact. Procedure first. Distortion second. Human cost last. A second officer appeared at the far end of the checkpoint, slowing as he approached, taking in the crowd before he took in the facts. The auburn-haired Transportation Security Administration officer set down a gray bin and half turned toward them, her mouth parting as if she meant to speak, then closing again when Travis cast a glance in her direction. That was the real force in the terminal now, not noise, but hesitation. Everybody felt it. The businessman near the rope barrier cleared his throat and looked away. An older woman in a camel coat pressed her lips together so tightly they nearly disappeared. The departure board above gate 22 flashed one more time. Final call. Naomi saw it reflected faintly in the polished floor and understood with a cold, quiet certainty that this was exactly how dignity gets tested in America. Not always with shouting. Not always with spectacle. Sometimes with delay. With implication. With a uniformed man deciding that your time, your body, your name, and your destination can all be interrupted because he does not like the way you stand inside yourself. Then Travis made his voice even louder and said the words he had been reaching toward from the beginning. "Ma'am, place your belongings down and come with us now." Us. As if consensus had appeared just because he wanted it to. Naomi let out one measured breath and lowered her folder to the screening counter with almost ceremonial care. A few papers slid slightly at the edges, revealing typed pages dense with citations and notes. The second officer glanced at them, then at her face, then quickly away. Naomi noticed that too. She noticed everything. the chill of conditioned air on her wrists, the soft squeak of sneakers somewhere behind her, the red eye of a camera on the far wall. The rising pressure in Travis's expression now that he had committed himself in front of witnesses and could no longer back down without exposing what this really was. When Naomi finally spoke, her voice was quieter than his, but everyone heard it. You are making a mistake you cannot undo by pretending it was policy. The sentence settled over the checkpoint like a bell tone after impact. No one moved for half a heartbeat. And in that small, suspended silence, with the crowd watching, the flight nearly gone, and the cameras still recording from their patient angles above, Travis chose escalation over restraint, and the entire terminal felt it happen. Then, almost strangely, everything became quiet. Not literally quiet, because Reagan National was never quiet. Not with boarding chimes spilling from ceiling speakers. Not with suitcase wheels ticking across stone like distant clocks. Not with espresso machines hissing behind the newsstand and children asking tired questions on their way to gates they could not pronounce. But inside the circle that had formed around Naomi Carter, the noise seemed to move backward, as if the whole terminal had taken one breath and forgotten how to let it go. She was guided to a gray metal chair near the side screening area, beneath a row of recessed lights that cast no warmth at all. Her leather case rested on the counter a few feet away, slightly open now, with the edges of legal papers visible inside like pale, orderly wings pressed flat after a storm. Naomi sat with her back straight and her hands still, not rigid, not performative, just composed in the way some people become composed when they understand that dignity is the last thing another person cannot take unless it is surrendered. The mark the moment had left on her was not loud. It was quieter than that. A delay, a public narrowing of space, a theft measured in minutes, in glances, in the chill of conditioned air against skin, in the knowledge that strangers had watched her be questioned as if her presence itself required explanation. Above her, the black dome of a camera looked down from the ceiling with its polished, unreadable eye. Naomi lifted her gaze to it for only a second, but in that second something in her expression changed. Not hope exactly, not fear, recognition. She knew institutions well enough to understand their two faces. One face smiled in press statements and polished mission language. The other lived in hallways, in choices, in the space between policy and practice where human character revealed itself without intending to. Cameras belonged to both worlds. They could be decoration, or they could be memory. Nearby, Officer Travis Hale stood speaking in low tones to the second officer, his posture sharp with the brittle energy of a man trying to stay ahead of consequences he could not yet see. From this distance, his confidence looked different. Smaller somehow, less like authority and more like effort. Naomi noticed that too. She noticed the Transportation Security Administration officer with auburn hair standing at her station without processing the next gray bin. She noticed the older woman in the camel coat still lingering by the lane divider when she should have been halfway to her gate by now. She noticed the college student pretending to scroll on his phone while keeping the camera line in sight. Witnesses, she thought, are not always brave in the moment. Sometimes they become brave later, when the room changes and truth has somewhere to land. The departure board beyond the checkpoint flickered again, and when Naomi turned her head, she saw that her flight to Washington was no longer marked final call. It had shifted to gate closed. The words glowed amber against the blue screen, indifferent and exact. For a brief moment, something human crossed her face at last. Not panic, not defeat, but the private ache of a disciplined person watching someone else's prejudice alter the architecture of her day. She had prepared for arguments in federal chambers, for long legal analysis, for men who challenged her reasoning because they resented its force. She had not prepared to lose an ordinary flight because one uniformed stranger had confused bias for instinct and control for competence. Yet even then, she did not unravel. She drew in one slow breath, held it, and let it out through parted lips. Her father used to tell her that when a room turns cruel, the first thing it tries to take from you is your rhythm. Keep your breathing, he would say, and you keep your mind. Naomi kept both. The light above her chair reflected softly along the polished floor. Somewhere farther down the terminal, rain had begun to freckle the tall windows facing the runway, faint silver dots catching what little afternoon sun remained. Aircraft lights blinked through the glass like patient signals from another world, one governed by schedules and weather instead of wounded pride. Naomi looked once more at the camera overhead, then lowered her eyes to the floor where the reflection of that black dome shimmered in the bright tile beside her shoe. She did not know yet who would review the footage. She did not know how many people would try to explain this away before anyone spoke honestly. But she knew something Travis did not. Time did not only bury things. Sometimes, under the right light, it developed them. Rain thickened against the runway windows in a silver mist, turning the afternoon light into something softer and more revealing. And that was when the machinery around Naomi finally began to shift. Not loudly, not with an announcement. Just the subtle change that comes when the truth starts moving through a system that was built to delay it. The auburn-haired Transportation Security Administration officer, whose name tag read Elena Price, stepped away from her station and disappeared through a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. She did not look at Naomi as she passed, but Naomi noticed the firmness in her stride, the kind that comes when hesitation has finally given way to conscience. Across the terminal, Officer Travis Hale was still speaking with clipped certainty to the second officer, gesturing once toward Naomi, once toward the checkpoint lane, building his version of the moment piece by piece as though repetition alone could make it real. But even from a distance, the shape of the room had begun to turn against him. The older woman in the camel coat had not left. The college student had stopped pretending to scroll and was now staring openly toward the side area. The businessman by the stanchions shifted his weight and looked uncomfortable in the expensive way people do when they realize neutrality may one day sound like cowardice. Naomi remained seated, hands folded lightly in her lap, her breathing slow and measured. She knew that when institutions lie, they often do it first through confidence. The facts usually arrive later, carrying less volume but more weight. A few minutes passed. Then a man in a dark suit and airport operations badge emerged from the restricted corridor with Elena beside him. He was in his early 50s, clean-shaven, compact, the kind of person whose authority did not need height or noise to announce itself. His name tag read Daniel Brooks. He did not go to Travis first. He looked to the camera above the checkpoint, then to Naomi, then to the open leather case on the counter with its visible pages of legal text. Something flickered across his face, not recognition yet, but the first warning that this was not the routine incident he had been led to expect. "What happened here?" he asked, and the terminal seemed to tighten around the question. Travis answered too quickly. Naomi noticed that immediately. He described non-compliance, resistance, a security concern that had required intervention. His voice was smooth again, almost relieved, as if official language had finally returned to protect him. Daniel Brooks listened without interrupting, but he did not nod. Elena stood beside him with her jaw set and her hands clasped too tightly at her waist. When Travis finished, she spoke, in a careful voice that nevertheless cut through the checkpoint more cleanly than his had. "Sir, the overhead cameras captured the full interaction." That sentence changed the air. It was a small sentence, fewer than a dozen words, but it landed with the force of a locked door opening somewhere no one expected. Daniel turned his head fully toward her. "All angles?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Elena said. "And ambient audio from the lane." Travis's expression shifted so slightly that most people would have missed it, but Naomi did not. The confidence did not vanish. It fractured, just at the edges, like thin ice hearing weight before it breaks. Daniel looked back at Naomi then, really looked at her for the first time, not as a passenger delayed in a side chair, but as a person who had remained astonishingly composed under public humiliation. "Ma'am," he said, his tone noticeably different from everyone else's, "did you identify yourself?" Naomi held his gaze. "I provided the identification I was asked for," she replied. Daniel frowned almost imperceptibly, then reached toward the counter where her boarding documents and credentials had been placed in the confusion. He picked up the identification card Travis had handled so casually and read it once. Then again, the color left his face in slow, visible increments. Elena saw it happen and leaned forward slightly. The second officer looked over, then straightened as if an electric current had passed through the floor. Daniel's eyes lifted from the card to Naomi, and whatever assumptions had governed the last 10 minutes fell away in silence. "Judge Carter," he said, barely above a whisper. Naomi did not answer immediately. She only watched him with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. as if the title mattered less than the fact that no one had needed it in order to treat her with basic dignity. Behind Daniel, the rain slid down the terminal windows in long glassy lines. The camera above them kept staring in its patient black stillness. And in that suddenly fragile pocket of fluorescent light and polished tile, everyone understood at once that the footage was no longer just a record of what had happened to a passenger. It was about to become evidence. For a few seconds, nobody in the terminal seemed to know where to look. The rain kept slipping down the tall windows. The departure board kept changing other people's plans. Somewhere near Gate 19, a child laughed at something small and ordinary, and the sound felt almost unreal inside the silence that had settled around Naomi Carter. Daniel Brooks was still holding her identification card, but now he held it with both hands, as if the weight of it had changed. Across from him, Officer Travis Hale stood very still, the kind of stillness that does not come from control, but from a mind racing too late to find a door out. His shoulders were still squared. His uniform was still pressed. His badge still caught the overhead light. Yet something essential had already left him. It was not authority. It was certainty. Daniel turned his head toward Elena Price. "Get the footage pulled now," he said, and this time there was no softness in his voice at all. Elena nodded once and moved quickly toward the restricted door, her shoes striking the floor with the hard rhythm of someone no longer willing to confuse silence with professionalism. Travis finally spoke, but what came out was thinner than before. "Sir, with respect," she was interfering with a live screening lane. Daniel looked at him for one long second, then lowered the identification card and asked, "Did you state a lawful basis for detaining her?" Travis opened his mouth, paused, then reached for the phrases that had served him up to this point. Security concern, escalation, noncompliance. But the words no longer fit the room. They floated there like empty labels on the wrong file. Naomi remained seated, her hands resting lightly together, her navy coat still buttoned, her leather case still open on the counter beside neatly stacked papers. She had not changed. That was what unsettled everyone most. The entire terminal had rearranged itself around her, and she had not once needed to perform outrage to prove that something unjust had happened. Daniel drew a breath through his nose and looked back at Naomi with visible shame. "Judge Carter," he said quietly, "I am sorry." The apology was sincere, but it landed inside a truth too large for one sentence. Naomi lifted her eyes to him. "You did not stop it," she said, and her voice was calm enough to make the words hurt more. Daniel did not defend himself. He did not offer policy. He did not hide behind process. He only gave a small nod, the kind people give when denial has become impossible. A few feet away, the second officer shifted awkwardly, suddenly fascinated by the floor. The older woman in the camel coat covered her mouth with her fingers. The college student lowered his phone without filming. Even the businessman near the lane divider seemed to shrink inside his tailored jacket, as if money and distance had failed to protect him from the moral weight of witnessing. Then Elena returned with a tablet and handed it to Daniel. He stepped aside beneath the camera dome, tapped the screen, and reviewed the first angle in silence. Naomi could not hear the audio from where she sat, but she did not need to. She could see the moment it registered. Daniel's jaw tightened. He replayed a section, switched to a second camera, then a third. On the screen, the truth would have looked plain and unadorned. A woman asked for a reason. A man with power could not bear the question. The distortion had not survived contact with memory. Daniel lowered the tablet very slowly. When he turned back toward Travis, the entire emotional geometry of the terminal had changed. No one was waiting to see who held authority anymore. They were waiting to see whether authority could still recognize truth when it was no longer convenient. "Turn in your access credentials," Daniel said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. Travis blinked once, as if language itself had failed him. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding." Daniel's eyes did not leave his face. "No," he said. "It is a record." The sentence moved through the checkpoint like cold air. Travis looked around then, maybe for support, maybe for a witness willing to rescue him with doubt. But there was nowhere left to place the blame. Not on Naomi, not on confusion, not on pressure. The cameras had been patient. The room had been watching. And the truth, once it arrived, did not need to shout. Daniel took one step toward Naomi and placed her identification and boarding documents carefully on top of her case file, like a man returning something more than paper. "We will rebook your flight," he said. Naomi looked at the documents, then at him, and for the first time a deep tiredness showed faintly in her eyes. Not weakness, not surrender, just the cost of having to survive what should never have happened. Then she reached for her papers with slow, steady hands, and while the rain traced silver lines down the runway glass and Travis stood in the fluorescent light with nowhere left to hide, Naomi chose the one thing powerful men never expect from the people they have wronged. She chose not humiliation, but restraint, and that choice exposed him more completely than anger ever could. Naomi closed the leather case with both hands and pressed her palm over the worn top for a moment, as if steadying not the papers inside it, but the shape of the day itself. Around her, the terminal slowly remembered how to move. A boarding chime sounded from another concourse. Someone laughed too loudly near the coffee stand, then lowered their voice as if the air still carried consequence. Rain softened against the tall windows overlooking the runway, and the late afternoon light came through in pale silver bands that stretched across the polished floor. Daniel Brooks stepped aside to clear her path, his posture stripped now of administrative distance. Elena Price stood near the checkpoint with her hands folded, her expression quiet and raw, as though she had just watched something inside the building crack open that had been sealed for years. Officer Travis Hale remained where he was, no longer the fixed center of the lane, no longer the man who could bend a crowded room around his suspicion. Without the shelter of certainty, he looked suddenly ordinary, and in that ordinariness there was something almost unbearable to witness, because harm so often arrives through people who seem most committed to looking official while forgetting how to remain human. Naomi rose from the gray metal chair with measured grace. She smoothed the front of her navy coat, adjusted the strap of her bag, and lifted her chin toward the broad windows where aircraft lights blinked through the rain like patient signals in the distance. Her flight was gone. The hearing in Washington would need to be rearranged. Calls would have to be made. Statements might be requested. Reports would be written in careful language by people hoping language could contain what conscience could not. She knew all of that. She knew the machinery ahead. But she also knew this moment did not belong only to loss. It belonged to revelation. Daniel spoke softly, offering an escort, a private room, anything that might make the remainder of her time there easier. Naomi turned to him, and when she answered, her voice carried no triumph, only a tired clarity that seemed to settle over everyone within earshot. "Do not make me the exception," she said. "Make this impossible for the next woman." No one replied. There was nothing to improve in the sentence. It did not accuse the innocent, and it did not excuse the guilty. It simply laid the truth down where everyone could see it. The older woman in the camel coat lowered her eyes. The businessman at the lane divider removed his glasses and cleaned them though they were not wet. The college student slipped his phone into his pocket and stood straighter, as if shame and admiration had reached him at once. Elena blinked hard and gave one small nod. Daniel looked at Naomi as though he wanted to promise reform in one breath, but understood better than to answer moral failure with polished words. Naomi shifted the case file under her arm and began to walk. Her heels made a quiet, even rhythm across the tile, not hurried, not hesitant, just sure. As she passed beneath the black camera dome, the reflected light touched the side of her face and the silver at her wristwatch, and for one brief second her figure appeared twice, once in flesh and once in the shining floor beneath her, like memory refusing to fade. Behind her, the checkpoint remained still. Ahead of her, the terminal opened into glass, rain, distance, and the long, bright corridor leading toward customer service, rebooking desks, and the unfinished work of justice. Naomi did not look back. She did not need to. The truth was no longer behind her. It was everywhere now, caught in footage, lodged in witnesses, moving silently from one conscience to another. And as she walked through the silver light with her shoulders square and her breathing calm, the terminal offered its final, rarest sound, not apology, not explanation, but the hushed and unmistakable silence that falls when power has been stripped bare and dignity refuses to bow.